Hello again. This week we've had a new scheme for COVID restrictions brought into law by Parliament. The idea is that this three-tier system will simplify the variety of local restrictions, but already there are debates about the details. Over the last few months there have been a number of different ways of categorising where we are in the outbreak and what restrictions might apply. Back in early March we were being more careful about not shaking hands and so on. Then there was a sort of blurred period in the middle of the month with more and more recommendations from the government and the Methodist Church nationally deciding that we would close our buildings for public worship. And then finally the government closed all the church buildings anyway. Later on there was quite a bit of lobbying from some denominations for churches to be made an exception to lockdown rules. And in the end that happened. We became an exception to the rules. And in some ways we still are, although there are more exceptions now than there were then. On the face of it, and if you look at the statistics, there may well be good reason for that, because transmission of the virus seems much more likely in, say, hospitality venues than in churches. And having been out for a couple of meals and having been to a couple of church services in the last couple of months, frankly, I can see why. I know which place I feel safer in. But I wonder what it means to be an exception, to be different, to be special. In the new three-tier system of restrictions, places of worship are still an exception. Even if we were to get to the very high tier status, services in church can continue as long as we are COVID secure, as they say. For us in a medium risk area, as it is at the moment, we can continue as before, with mixing in church allowed in groups of no more than 6 people, and still with physical distancing in place. For the 2 higher levels, we'd not be allowed any mixing indoors with anyone outside our household or support bubble, so definitely no chatting after the service. But we could still meet for worship. Maybe that's fine if we can continue to demonstrate that we're being careful enough with our safety precautions. And while it continues to be the case that outbreaks are not traced back to places of worship, but what will it be like if one or more outbreaks are centred on churches, as has happened in other countries earlier in the year? Would we still be an exception? And would we want to be? I wonder what it means to be an exception, to be different, to be special. Another interesting exception is Remembrance Sunday activities. The new legislation explicitly talks about gatherings to commemorate Remembrance Sunday as an exception to the general rules. And I wonder why that is. It seems notable to me that the government would want Remembrance Sunday to be an exception. It's apparently too important for us to do without it, even when we have to do without so many other things. And I wonder why. But whatever you think about Remembrance Sunday, it brings us up close with the question of what the relationship is between the church and the state. Now, obviously, we have an established church in England whose bishops sit in the House of Lords to work on legislation for the whole of the UK. That in itself says something about the other nations of the UK which are not covered by the Church of England. And it says something about other denominations and other faiths which are not covered by the Church of England. But perhaps that's something to leave for another time. This week's thought might not be making as much sense as I'd hoped, but it's certainly given me ideas for future ones. So yes, there are deep links between church and state in England, if you're Anglican. But what I'm really getting at today is how our life as a church relates to what the state says and does. How much should it matter to us, for example, to obey the law of the land? You might think the answer is obvious, but I don't think it's as easy a question to answer as it seems. What we're doing in churches with regard to COVID is probably going beyond what the law of the land actually requires of us, and maybe even going beyond government guidelines. We're in a good position to work like this because we're not dependent, like a restaurant or a pub might be, we're not dependent on having as many people in as possible to make enough profit to pay our workers. Making money and providing paid employment is not our main reason for being in the building. And that's where we differ from those pubs and restaurants where I felt a bit less safe recently. At other times, we might feel challenged to break the law in order to follow Christ. We might think that kind of option is really only an option in a country and in a time with a more obviously oppressive regime, but perhaps that's a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind. It's not in and of itself obvious that we should always do exactly what the government tells us to do, just because. And some people do see COVID restrictions as evidence of an oppressive regime. For us here and now, for most things, presumably we will do what the government tells us to do. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge the law or challenge the status quo when we look at it in the light of following Christ. Over the centuries, the Church has swung one way and another on the question of how involved we should be in the running of society. Some traditions have decided to pull away as much as possible and make church membership an entirely voluntary thing. Some have been so heavily involved that if you come from this place, you belong to this church. Some have tried to shut themselves off from society and not involve themselves in politics, though of course by not involving yourself in politics, you are effectively supporting the status quo and the people who already have power. And some church traditions have been campaigning in various ways. There's no one way of relating church to state. I wonder what it means to be an exception, to be different, to be special. Should the church be an exception? Should the church be different? Should the church be special? Well, we all feel different sometimes, I imagine. Sometimes that can be problematic if we feel we're better than everyone else, or if we feel we're worse than everyone else, because those things are not really going to be true, are they? And we're probably all tempted to make ourselves an exception. We seem to be psychologically well disposed to people like us, or people we think of as in our group. That's part of the reason why unconscious bias happens, and it's part of the reason why trust in leaders is so difficult when they don't seem to notice that it can look like one rule for them and another rule for the rest of us. But one rule for me and another for everyone else is tempting. Being an exception is tempting. And are we special? Well, in the end, we are all exceptions. We are all different because we are much more than the labels people put on us. Despite what I wondered about last week, that our identity is bound up with other people, despite that, we are still ourselves. And in God's sight, each of us is a special case. The key, perhaps, is for us to notice that that applies to other people too. The labels and the categories we give to other people are convenient fictions. They can only get us so far. God bless. See you soon.